Shalom, everybody, and welcome to the Yishai Fleischer Show, broadcasting live from Judea. We're going to wait just a few minutes until everybody joins us here on the show, on the live stream, on the broadcast on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Periscope of Twitter. So that's really fun. And I'm going to be joined today by one of our favorite guests, Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen, who's a lecturer at Machon Meir and one of the founders of the Vision Movement. I have a wonderful banner that I've made for you. There it is, visionmovement.org. Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen is a wonderful historian and thinker, and we're going to start together in just a few minutes. I'd love for anybody to comment, let me know how the sound sounds, how the audio, how the visual is for you, and if it's thumbs up, we'll start getting going in just a minute. So let me know, and I'd love to hear how you're doing and where you're coming from. So fire off a comment wherever you're seeing this, and that's going to be really appreciated. I already see a thumbs up, and there's viewers coming in, but no comments yet, so I'm looking forward to hearing from you guys. And speaking with Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen, we're going to talk about Hanukkah, light it up. That's right, light it up this year. Oh, there's Lou. There he is. Lou, how are you, sir? Shalom, Yishai and Rabbi Cohen. And Scott says, looks and sounds good. All right, so here we go. A minute and a half in, we'll start the show. Here we go. Shalom, everybody, and welcome to the Yishai Fleischer Show, broadcasting live from Judea to the world. You're a part of it wherever you are. Shalom to all of our friends watching and listening throughout the world, including on the Land of Israel Network, and also on my Facebook page, Yishai Fleischer, on Twitter, Periscope, and on my YouTube channel, Eye on Zion. Thank you so much for joining us, and it's time to get excited. It's time to light it up because we're just a day before Hanukkah. And every year, more and more throughout my life, I've been feeling more and more emotional and more connected to Hanukkah, that it's starting to approach the number one slot of like my favorite holiday. And that's just there's something so powerful because it brings together the temple and Jerusalem, Zionism, nationalism, revolt, a fight for the truth, fight for our land, a fight against lies, a fight for control, a fight for sovereignty, and incredible courage. That's what Hanukkah is. It's an incredible story of miracles and courage, miracles that come through courage that comes through miracles, and that's why it's becoming so emotional. And of course, there's all the other stuff, great calories, great fun, sweet things, a great time with the kids, because the kids are off, although during Corona time they've been off all this time anyway, more or less. In any case, I am joined by Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen, who is a lecturer at Machon Meir and also one of the founders of the Vision Movement, which I have here up on the screen right now, which is visionmovement.org. He's one of their chief ideological officers, and also some even say the war priest, in the sense that he moves it along. Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen, thank you so much for joining me. And talking, I think, about one of your favorite holidays as well. Am I right?
Absolutely, maybe for slightly different reasons, Yishai, but certainly Hanukkah is, my soul is very deeply connected to Hanukkah. Like, things really come alive inside me when we approach.
Go ahead. What are those reasons?
First of all, I'm a Kohen, as you know, and I come from the same line of Kohanim as the Hashmonaim, like the family of Matityahu and his sons. I live on this mountain where you used to live, which was actually here in the Gofna Hills next to Beit El, where the Maccabee partisan camp actually was for the first few years of the revolt, when the war consisted of guerrilla raids against, Hellenized ruling class Jews and occupation soldiers. They would, for the most part, be launched from this mountain here. We still have the guard towers, we still have the caves, we still have the olive presses and wine presses. When I go running on this mountain, I'm training where the Maccabees trained for war. And that's deep and that's meaningful for me. Like, it makes me honestly feel like a character in a later chapter of the same story that they were characters in. And I think that's important, really, not just for me, for all of us. I think that's really, something that's been very inspiring in my life, this idea that I'm part of a story much bigger than myself. I'm participating in one of the most amazing and climactic chapters of that story. And of course, I think it's important for us to be able to really dig deep into our own story, into our own national identity, into our own history, and unearth all of the lessons that can help us succeed in this current generation.
Yehudah, when I lived on that mountain, also where you live today in Beit El, which is a very holy place, a very holy town, you could look down and see the Arab Palestinian towns underneath Beit El in the valleys below. Mm-hmm. But to go there and to just walk freely in the land is something that's kind of prohibitive. It's dangerous, and you're not wanted, and you can't really walk freely on the land. And a lot of Jews today exist in kind of enclaves, shall we say, ghettos, where we're, on the one hand, we're free in our land, we're returned to our land, but on the other hand, we can't really walk fearlessly. And one of the things that the Maccabees had over the Seleucid Greeks is that they had the advantage of terrain. They knew the terrain. They knew it well. And the Syrian Greeks did not know it well. So they attacked them at night. They attacked them from in valleys that they kind of lured them into. And they always had the advantage of terrain and the advantage of surprise. But I feel that today, in many ways, like we don't know the land in the same way. We don't have that same breadth of being connected to this land. And in some ways, we're still strangers, and maybe have become more strangers in the last few years. I think maybe the spirit of the 60s and in the Six-Day War, we were fearless, but now much more fear has crept into Israeliness. What do you think about that?
I think, well, first of all, I would say that we're not all afraid, that there are many Jews. We have youth who do go, wherever they want to go, and in some cases have to be pulled by our security forces out of Area B, or I'll be honest, last Hanukkah, I went into Ramallah for the first time. I decided that I've been living next to Ramallah, just north of Ramallah, for so many years, like, why don't I ever go inside? So on the 8th day of Hanukkah last year, I did. And I went in, I couldn't really eat anything because of kashrut reasons. I could just have the Magnum bars and the makolet. But it was interesting. I did a little shopping, went to the hookah bar, walked around, got some souvenirs, some books. But we do have, first of all, we're not also afraid, number one. Number two, you're right. The Maccabees did use the geography and topography of our land as a weapon, because they really were natives in a way that we still have to get back to. I think we're complicated. A lot of what you said, I think, needs to be unpacked. We're in a role today, I think, that we're very uncomfortable with. I'm really, really, really comfortable with the role of the Maccabees. There's a foreign occupier in our land. We're the native people. Let's fight them. Our situation today, as a result of things that have happened to us, like being forced into exile for so many centuries, having our identity, it's not just that we were exiled and we remained, in static form for all those centuries. Other things happened to us, as you know, and as I'm sure your listeners know. A lot of bad things happened to us and developed certain characteristics within us, certain insecurities within us, a certain level of trauma that we still have to heal from. And so we came back here through Zionism. And when I say Zionism, I definitely don't mean, I don't think of the Maccabees as Zionists. I think that's really anachronistic and problematic to call them Zionists. I think they were definitely Jewish nationalists, or Judean nationalists. I think Zionism, at least for me, it really needs to be limited to a very specific movement that existed between the 1880s and 1960s. And I think all Jewish liberation movements beyond that should just be called Jewish liberation movements, and not, and I think it trips us up to apply Zionism as a catch-all term. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because of exactly what you said. We, as a result of Zionism's complexities and uniqueness, bringing an ancient native people back to life in the land they were displaced from, but through tools of colonialism, has put us in a role that we're very uncomfortable with. There are many people who, at least on a surface level, see us in the role of the Syrian Greeks today. We are the occupation forces. We are manning the checkpoints. We are patrolling, the mountains, etc. We are in control, that's for sure. We make the decisions. Whether our politicians have the courage or don't have the courage to do what's in the national interest is a different question. But at the end of the day, if Prime Minister Netanyahu decided tomorrow morning that he wants to build the Beit HaMikdash, he just has to make a couple phone calls. He doesn't have to fight the British to free the Temple Mount. He doesn't even have to fight the Jordanians, who are officially in control. He just has to give our security forces orders to go in.
Didn't the Maccabees have to deal with people living on the land that were antithetical to Jewish liberation, like the Idumeans, and that they forced a big chunk of them out, and the rest of them they converted forcefully?
Well,
so
actually,
they also had to deal with internal people.
Something very interesting. Yochanan Hyrcanus, the son of Shimon ben Mattatyahu, conquered the Edomim, the Edomians, enslaved them, and set them free, which halachically made them all Jews. Meaning, and they later some of them became problematic. Like Herod is, as somebody who's so connected to Hebron and Jerusalem, that we still benefit from many of Herod's grand projects. Some might call him a shallow nationalist, but he also very much believed in, if we want to be anachronistic, in David Ben-Gurion's superpower patronage doctrine, where Israel needs, or Judea needs, a big, powerful empire on our side in order to survive. So, while Herod wanted Israel to be strong, and he was proud of his, Jewish identity and his Edomite identity, he also, he also believed that we need to be part of the Roman Empire. Now, it should also be said, though, that other Edomians became our allies in the Great Revolt against Rome. Like we see in Josephus, that some of the rebel factions that were fighting alongside the Sikari and the Kanaim were Edomians, who were fighting for the freedom of Israel against Roman occupation. So it's a mixed bag. But yes, the Maccabees had different local enemies who were not the occupation force, and dealt with them in different ways at different periods based on so many different political considerations.
Right. And also when Ezra and Nehemiah came in, they had to deal with Sumerians and other people who were antithetical to Jewish rights. And so they had to fight them. By the way, the Second Temple arrival of Jews was called Shivat Zion, the return of the folks to Zion, which is very, very similar to Zionism. The idea, and I live today here in Judea on a street called Shivat Zion Street. Shivat Zion is, in many ways, when I speak to ultra-Orthodox folks, they don't like the word Zionism, but I say, but are we in a period of Shivat Zion? And they say, yes. And so okay, you know what I mean? If you it's like six of one, half dozen of the other. If you need, if you're not comfortable with the term Zionism, by the way, I want to tell you that what you're saying, on the one hand, my good friend tour guide Aaron, who's one of the best tour guides in the country, and a sofer and a father of many, God bless him, he says I couldn't agree more with what Yehudah is saying about Zionism, but I understand where he's coming from. I'm gonna guess. I'm not going to say I know for sure, but I'm going to guess it also comes from the fact that he's also Chabad. And so for him, Zionism is like a secular Zionism that was anti-religious. But for another listener right now, which is Shildrill 42, says Zionism began once the Jewish people were forced into exile. So, okay, like for me, I like the word Zionism. I think it is a catch-all. It just means the yearning to return to Zion like Shivat Zion. I don't think of it as the limited thing that happened in the 19th century, which was inspired partially by European nationalism. I think of it as a very natural movement that always was here. It just has a slightly different term, just like you and in your various periods in life have had different organizations that have had slightly different names. But okay.
This argument is important if it's not theoretical and it actually has practical applications for what Israel does next, for what Am Yisrael decides to do next. And that's where I think the machloket gains value. So I want to address what both, was that, I can't read what his...
that's Shildrill 42.
Shildrill 42. So I would definitely agree that, we have this idea, our sages teach us that the Mashiach, this leader who's eventually supposed to lead us to victory, this messianic figure, or maybe this messianic movement that's supposed to inspire us to liberate ourselves, was born on Tisha B'Av, meaning the moment that the Romans destroyed our civilization, destroyed Jerusalem, cast us into exile, began the struggle to return. calling that Zionism, I think, is pretty anachronistic. I don't think Rabbi Akiva or Shimon Bar Kokhba would have recognized that word Zionism. It's kind of like calling Jesus a Palestinian. He wouldn't have really recognized that word. It's kind of anachronistic to call him that.
No, but they would have that's what my point was. Would they have recognized Shivat Zion and
And
the Second Temple? Certainly they would have.
The way I relate to Zionism here, and maybe this will resonate with you, maybe it won't, I see Zionism, or in Hebrew Tzionut, as the movement of Mashiach ben Yosef. Right? Even Yosef and Zion share a gematria, right? 156. Right? Zion and Yosef. We can do the math later, but I hope I'm right. But
sounds good.
Right, sounds good. Well, we know they share a gematria. I think it's 156. Now, I think when we look at, the Gaon of Vilna's writings in Kol HaTorah on the Mashiach ben Yosef process, he refers to that as the material rebuilding of Am Yisrael, the return of the Jewish people to our land, and the material rebuilding of our nation. Rav Kook referred in his eulogy of Binyamin Zev Herzl, he related to Zionism as this movement of Mashiach ben Yosef. But at the same time, elsewhere, Rav Kook is critical of Zionist thought, saying that Zionism, and when we say Zionism, we don't mean every Jewish liberation movement throughout time. We're talking about Zionism as it defined itself, as it was a movement called the Zionist movement, led by specific people with specific thoughts and writings and activities. Rav Kook says in the Ma'amar Yerushalayim that Zionism, this ideology, is not deep or sufficient enough to sustain a living nation, let alone revive a dead nation. Meaning he was critical, but he saw Hashem doing something, that there was a process taking place and that it should be supported. But the idea was always that once Yosef builds the vessel, the force of Yehudah, and this is very relevant to our Parsha, this week, our Parshat Vayeshev, that we see the contrast between Yosef and Yehudah, these two major sons of Yaakov, like the major son of Rachel and the major son of Leah. Their forces express themselves. These are forces within our identity that express themselves at different points in our history. I think that Zionism was very much an expression of Yosef, the tribal force of Yosef, that's concerned with the material well-being of the Jewish people. Even today, I would say, our security, our economy, high tech, Tel Aviv, all of that is Yosef. That's Zionism today. When I think of Zionism today, it's Tel Aviv. That's where Zionism ended up, because, especially according to their own ideological conceptions, what they believed they were doing. But Rav Kook never really called himself a Zionist. Also, it's important to note that the Lechi, the Lochanei Cherut Yisrael, the fighters for the freedom of Israel, never called themselves Zionists. They were very clear about this idea: we are not Zionists. Zionism is Chaim Weizmann. Zionism is Mapai. Zionism is Jabotinsky. We're not that. We're something else. We're an indigenous people's liberation movement. And in that way, I would say the fighters for the freedom of Israel, the Lechi, were much more acting in the tradition of the Maccabeim and Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kokhba and the Zealots and even their Edomite allies than the Zionist movement was. The Zionist movement...
Yehuda, I find that a lot of these things are really about brands more than even about ideology. And I sometimes find, like I one time saw a Chabad young man arguing with a religious Zionist young man, and the religious Zionist young man was saying, it's Reshit Tzmichad Geulatenu, and he's like, how could you say it's the beginnings of redemption? And the other guy, the Chabadnik, was saying, no, it's Ikvata to Mashiach. It's the steps, the footsteps of the pre-steps before the Messianic period. So one was talking about redemption, the other one was talking about Messianic times. But they felt that they needed to argue, and that is because sometimes, like, Jews love to be in their camp and in their argument. I mean, our central book is the Talmud, which is the book of arguments. But when I use the word Zionism, for me, it's not that grouping of people, which was the political movement of that time. It's a general trend. It's a general trend of the return to Zion. There again, I go back to Shivat Zion, or and I say also to my ultra-Orthodox friends, I say to them, well, are we living in kibbutz galuyot? Are we living in the ingathering of the exiles? They're like, yeah. I'm like, good. Okay, so we can agree on something if the terminology isn't the same. But at the end, okay, you're making a distinction between Yosef and Yehudah, or between, let's say, Saul and King David. All right. But the general movement of recapturing, re-establishing a Jewish presence in the land of Israel and then a Jewish kingdom in it, whatever the name for that thing is, that's what's happening. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. From a historical perspective, that's what's taking place. Academically, I think that Zionism would be limited in the way that I'm limiting it. Like any professor of Jewish history or Zionist history would probably limit it to my definitions. It's certainly safer. But yes, I agree with you that something is happening in history. The Jewish people have come home. I would say that Zionism, the Zionist movement, despite its ideological limitations, achieved many of the historic aspirations of the Jewish people. Meaning, if you look at some of the Zionist writers, you see they were just looking to end anti-Semitism and make the Jewish people normal again. We did so much more than that. Zionism did so much more than that.
Right.
But it did end. I think Zionism succeeded in 1967 when we reached Zion, when we reached Yerushalayim, when we reached the Temple Mount in the Six-Day War. And I think since the Six-Day War, Am Yisrael has been ready for a new Jewish liberation movement that can actually, first of all, identify and achieve the next objectives of Jewish history using the successes that Zionism created as our tools. So now that we're in such a better position, and that was, by the way, what I'm talking about is important in relation to Hanukkah, because this was ultimately the failure of the Hasmoneans as well. Once we achieved victory following a 26-year guerrilla war, the descendants of Shimon who took power, which they shouldn't have done. They were from my tribe. My tribe shouldn't rule. My tribe isn't supposed to be in the malchut, in the kingship. We're priests. We can go to war. We can inspire the nation. We can teach Torah. We can work in the temple, but we are not meant to rule the nation. And we did. My tribe did. And what we were missing, and you can see this in the policies and even in the names they gave their children. The Hasmonean dynasty should have done what every nation who achieves liberation is supposed to do. They should have had a post-colonial conversation. They should have said, okay, we've been occupied by the Greeks. Before that, we were occupied by the Persians. Before that, we were occupied by the Babylonians. Before that, we were free. Let's talk about what happened to us. Let's talk about how our identities changed, how our situations were changed. Let's talk about what we want to put back to the way it was in the Beit Rishon period and what we don't want to put back. And let's actually discuss what the identity and values we want to see expressed through the policies and institutions of the kingdom we're creating. We didn't have that conversation. And because we didn't have that conversation, we created space for the Roman Empire to come in and dominate us, just as the Greeks had, even worse. And I think that's the same thing today. We fought the British to free our land, but once they were gone, the Zionist leaders, not the freedom fighters, but the Zionist leaders who took power, essentially put a Jewish flag and Jewish decorations on a British colonial system. And we have yet to have this conversation about what makes a state Jewish in the modern age. What does a Jewish state look like in the 21st century? And until we have this conversation, we're going to leave ourselves open and vulnerable to attacks from so many directions. Not just militarily, obviously, but ideological attacks, cultural imperialism. But when you look at the influence that organizations, whether it's the New Israel Fund or the Tikva Fund, because both of them are pushing, westernization in our country, just from different political directions, we're only vulnerable to this because we haven't figured out our own identity yet. And that's what we need to do. We need to do what the Hasmoneans didn't following the Maccabean revolt. We need to have a post-colonial conversation where the nation collectively decides what this state should look like, what values and identity it should express. And we're not going to come to the same conclusions. But I think this requires us to transcend Zionism and create a post-Zionist Jewish liberation movement that can actually address the challenges confronting us today.
I came up a few years ago with a name for this let's call it... the word post-Zionist, has a negative connotation, but let's say, after Zionism movement, I called it Moriahism, right? Which is Mount Zion is one mountain, and Har Moriah is the mountain of holiness. That's the mountain where the temple stood. So maybe we can go into Moriahism. I would only say to you also that Tikva and the other organization, which the New Israel Fund. Well, at least they are trying to sway the conversation in their direction, right? Meaning to say they have a vision.
Well, hold on. Just to be fair, we run Vision Magazine, visionmag.org. We have lots of articles, podcasts, videos. We don't have the funds of New Israel Fund or Tikva Fund. With our limited resources, we are also trying to influence the conversation.
Right.
Of course, we invite people to join us at visionmag.org.
Very, 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 very fair. These people are trying very hard to get the conversation of what Israel's going. I think there's also one more step. You kind of said that Zionism did its job or reached its apex in the 6-Day War. I would say, really, where Zionism stopped in the classic, not in the classic, in the mid 19th century movement, and it stopped being that movement, was really in the Oslo period, maybe even in the Sinai Accords period, where basically they started eating themselves. Instead of being this movement to liberate the land of Israel and instill Judaism in this land, when you started creating a Palestinian state or a different state, or giving away our land to Egyptians or to Gazans or to Palestinians or whoever it is, or Jordanians for that matter, that was a moment where it's like, wait a minute, you're not achieving your goals, you're actually going the other way. And that's where I think really there was an awakening, like, whoa. There's something happening here, which is off kilter, and it's taking some kind of, you call it Westernism, let's call it secularism, let's call it, godlessness, or definitely not historically oriented, or just plain misguided, and started actually using the mechanism of the state of Israel to undo itself and to embed its enemies in its heartland, and to strengthen them, and to pay for their weapons, and to pay for their murderous aspirations, to pay for their brainwashing. And that was like a moment where, to me, it's like, wait a minute, this thing is definitely off kilter. Now we've come into a time where everybody will tell you that we're in better shape than in the 90s and the early 2000s. And there's more nationalism. There's also more Haredism, which is they're today, I think, the Kohanim of the country, in the sense that they're bringing the ingredient of Judaism into the Jewish state, even though they're not doing it as like a big teaching platform, just doing it more for themselves. But the atmosphere of Torah and Judaism is like spreading throughout the land. And I think in large part it's because the ultra-Orthodox world, also they have more kiruv, more bringing people closer operations than the religious Zionist world. And so, we're living in a better time where we're like straight leftism and of giving away the land is kind of like been stopped. It stopped basically at the Gaza withdrawal. And then we also had this last few years, which I'm sure you might disagree with, but we had this last few years where there was an American administration which also kind of helped. You would probably say that we should be doing it ourselves, and I wouldn't disagree with that. But there was a greater consciousness of the justice of Israel's cause and rage against some of the lies that have been told about us. And so we're in better shape. But that post-colonialist conversation, no, it's not. It hasn't happened. By the way, here's a simple conversation that hasn't happened. What about our system of governance? Our system of governance itself is
conversation.
Right, we have not had that conversation. Nobody's having that conversation.
I'll give you an example. Right now, there seems to be, or there has been for a few years, a fad in our political conversation, a trend towards talking about moving towards a two-party system, right? Big parties. For me, that would be diluting the country's Jewish identity. Because if you know anything about Jewish identity, if you have two Jews like us in a room, speaking to each other like right now, we usually find at least three opinions. Now that is part of our culture. Two Jews, three opinions. In which case, if our political system is going to express Jewish identity, we're not going to move towards two broad Big Ten parties. We're going to move towards more smaller ideological parties, because that would be an expression of our identity. Or we might say that a representative democracy with a parliament is not, the way to go. Maybe our culture demands much more of a participatory democracy, a direct democracy, with some kind of melech figurehead, or and a Kohen Gadol and a Sanhedrin, or at the very least, I'll give you an example. I think a lot of the conversations we're having aren't going deep enough. Whether it becomes a conversation over is Biden or Trump better for us? I think the Maccabees would have rejected the options. I think they would have said, we don't want any emperor, we want freedom. But also with the Supreme Court, when Ayelet Shaked was trying to, as justice minister, trying to reform the Supreme Court, her direction was to put more like quote unquote conservative justices on the court. I don't want to see conservative judges on the court. I want to see Rav Shmuel Eliyahu on the court. Like, I want to see Talmidei Chachamim on the court. Like, that's what I want to see happen to the Begatz. And you can keep, Dorit Benish or whoever, like Esther Chayut. Esther Chayut can stay there, but next to her should be a Talmid Chacham that's accepted by a large sector of the population, and next to him could be another Talmid Chacham who's accepted by a different large sector of the population, and you can have some of Esther Chayut's friends there too. But that would actually be a Supreme Court that expresses the identity and the diverse identity of the Jewish people. Because right now you have a Supreme Court, which is the most powerful political body in the land, that it represents a very tiny sector of Israeli society, which I would call Yosef, which I would call the Zionist sector, or the sector that when we talk about Yosef, it's complicated because
I just want to say in parentheses very tightly is that I know what you mean.
Well, let me give the caveat to explain.
Just one point, which is, but as a Zionist, I find to see the post-Zionist left as exactly in my camp, I find that to be anathema. Meaning to say, I don't think they're Zionists. I think they're doing things that are anti-Zionist. Again, it just depends how you understand Zionism. For me, it's like just a broader word. But okay, but we all know what we mean. We're talking about, as you said, national liberation. These people are not for Jewish national liberation.
I think part of our problem is we have these conversations using very foreign frameworks. When we use terminology like left-wing and right-wing or religious and secular to describe different groups within Am Yisrael, we're actually using very Christian or very Western labels and categories to try and define a society that it doesn't fit. Okay? I think it would be much more matim for us, and we can get very, we can go really deep with this, probably won't right now, but we can talk about different camps within Israel as representing Chesed and Gevurah and Tiferet and Hod and Netzach, etc. That'd be one way of us trying to apply our culture, our worldview to the different identities or different expressions of...
Well, I wouldn't say that would be our worldview. That would be a renaissance of our worldview, because at the end, Jewish people are always influenced by the Greeks or the Persians or the Romans or the Americans or the British. And we in many ways are like shapeshifters. We take certain foreign aspects and we play with them. We use those tools.
Yeah. But we need to be very careful with our filter. I agree. We influence, but we're also influenced. But when we're influenced, we have to make sure we have filtration system in place that doesn't cause us to behave in a way that's unhealthy or unnatural to who we are. So I would look at the different camps within Israel as different tribes, the different spiritual forces that shine into this world through the tribes. So I would say that the tribe of Israel that did manifest itself as Zionism, meaning did want the material rebuilding of the Jewish people, the material well-being of the Jewish people, that cared about creating a state, maybe for the purpose of being normal and like all other states, but wanted to create a Jewish state. Today, I think that force, what we call Yosef, manifests itself as those who are concerned with our security, concerned with our economy, concerned with our high-tech industry, but also want to be part of the West and see the regions of Samaria and Judea, the identity connected to those places, the conflict with the Palestinians in those places, as barriers to them having the type of state they want. I don't think they want no state. I think a lot of the Supreme Court justices and the journalists at Haaretz and people who live in North Tel Aviv want a Jewish state, want the Jewish people to be safe, but their vision for what that means is very different from ours. Now, I think that this force has a role. Yosef is important. We don't want to kick Yosef out of the national vehicle, but they can't be driving the car anymore. Our problem right now is that since 1967, and I think all the things you mentioned about Oslo and Camp David and surrendering the Sinai have been symptoms of the core problem, which is that since 1967, the force of Yehudah hasn't been able to step in and take the wheel and say, okay, Yosef did a great job, and Yosef's going to continue to do a great job in its role, but right now we need the content. Right now we need the identity. Right now we need to actually infuse the vehicle built by Yosef with the values, with the culture, with the identity, with the conception of destiny inherent in the force of Yehudah. And if you're saying the Haredim are contributing to that, great. Meaning,
I think so.
fantastic.
Especially when you walk around the Knesset, you always see that the Haredim, they bring a certain kind of like a strong Jewish sugar cube into this tea.
I will give you that. I will say that in our political system, the Haredim are not only the most maybe strongly Jewish, but also I think some of the best athletes, some of the best politicians in our system,
right.
In terms of getting the job done. So because they know what they're there to do, they've already defined their interests, defined their goals. They're going in to achieve certain objectives, and they do it well. And also they don't have, one of the things, whether it's right or wrong, that holds back some of the national religious political operatives is there is much more of a concern with Chilul Hashem in the eyes of Jews less connected to our identity. That tends to be much more of a in the foreground, that concern, and also there's also bigger considerations. Meaning one of the things that the Haredim haven't had to worry about until now. Maybe this will change, but for the most part, the objectives they're trying to achieve in Knesset don't directly conflict with what the United States is demanding Israel do. The problem that national religious politicians often have is that their political objectives force Israel into conflict with Western civilization. Whether we want to or not, whether a person like Naftali Bennett or Bezalel Smotrich are aware of this, the agenda that's being pushed by the national religious sector is an agenda that Western civilization cannot stomach. And even your favorite emperor, Donald Trump, demanded we give up 70% of Judea and Samaria. Meaning
he put that on the table, and we immediately, and I'll tell you that I have the kind of proud distinction of being amongst people who said from the get-go, we'll support you, President Trump, until the moment you tell us to divide our land, and when you do, we will get up on our hind legs and make a lot of trouble for that, and that's what we did. And I got an earful from all kinds of folks saying to me, how dare you guys, and you guys are slowing down, you don't know what you're doing, blah, 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 blah. But you know what? We knew what we were doing, and we supported President Trump's great steps and so many aspects of what we needed to start moving forward in this world. But when it came to the two-state solution that reared its ugly head in the so-called deal of the century, we just stood up against that, and we made a stink, and then later they blamed us for torpedoing the whole thing, which is totally fine by me. And so
that is even what, from your perspective, the best of American presidents also demanded territorial concessions from us.
But we did not accede to that, and we said no. And I personally don't think I have reason to believe this. I actually don't think this was actually something that what you call Emperor Trump, or I don't think it's something he wanted at all. Actually, I think it was actually our Emperor Netanyahu and Kushner who got together and wrote that thing up. And I have it on good sources that for Trump this was actually like a weird thing to try to sell, and he kind of. Anyway, as was predicted, it got flushed away in history. The only thing is, I'm sure that if indeed we do get a Biden presidency, I think that we will see the deal of the century brought back with Biden and team saying, "Hey, you guys agreed to this. That's what we want, a two-state solution. But we'll have the distinction and the pride to be able to say." But we stood against that, and we said no, and yes, we torpedoed that, and that was never going to happen. That was never part of the deal. So I'm very proud of the fact that we did not accept that idea.
One thing I want to add is that
you know what, give me a second. I want to add. You and I have been talking now for 40 minutes. Just want to throw in a few other people's comments. Our good friend Erica says, "Shalom and Hanukkah Sameach, rabbis, from all the listeners from the archipelago of Gothenburg, Sweden. Nothing beats the historic place where you guys are living. God bless you, Erica, and thank you so much for being with us, a good friend." And she also adds, "Yishai, you are very stylish today. I learned it from Yehudah, Rabbi Yehuda. He's the one who's taught me everything about that." As I mentioned, my good friend, tour guide Aaron, he writes, "No doubt Chabad has influenced my thinking, but ultimately I'm an independent thinker for better or for worse." No doubt about that as well. and you are he's everything he does is excellent. Tour guide Aaron, if you want to post your website, Aaron, I'd love to put it up for people. Lou says, please note that Modi'in and the surrounding area is the headquarters of the Maccabees in the story of Hanukkah. And indeed, Lou, there is a beautiful Maccabean synagogue that was unearthed and then covered over in Modi'in. You should get the authorities to unearth it all together and open it up for everybody. It's a beautiful place, and I really hope actually that we have a Hanukkah festival in Modi'in every year one day when we're like a national Chanukiah.
Lou, but before you move on, I think it's important that the Matityahu and his family were from Modi'in,
right?
And the revolt broke out in Modi'in. But once it broke out, they had to run. They couldn't stay in Modi'in, meaning Modi'in was never the headquarters of the revolution. Modi'in was just where they were from, and once the revolt broke out, they left to the Gofna Hills, and the Gofna Hills became the headquarters of the Maccabee Underground.
Mm-hmm.
Till Jerusalem was liberated in the actual event that we celebrate on Hanukkah, in the Battle of Beit Sur, or following the Battle of Beit Sur.
Right, which is here in Gush Etzion. Right, it was close. It was Beit Sur is a little bit to the south of Gush Etzion, and it's close to the community of what is it called? What's the southernmost Gush Etzion community? Always escapes me. And we'll come back to me in a second. Tour guide Aaron says my Instagram is Tour Guide Aaron, and if you get a chance to come to the land of Israel, he's really one of the best, and we'll show you the good land. And we'll teach you the good Torah. So, tour guide Aaron, God bless you. Okay, Yehudah, listen, we have a lot more to talk about, no doubt about it. And I want to tell you that I fundamentally do agree, though, with your basic premise that there's a conversation that has to be had about what Judaism, how Israel wants to be a Jewish state going forward. I think though, just one second. I'll let you jump in a second. One thing that I think that sometimes, I don't know if the word disagree is right here. I think that the Yosef energy still has work to do. For example, one of the things that fills me with Hanukkah pride right now is Route 60, which is the main route on the back of the Judean Samaria Ridge, at the very apex of the Judean Samaria Ridge. And right now, with full vigor and force, it's being widened out. Mm-hmm. And that avenue, that major route, that artery is being opened up for, quadrupling the amount of traffic that could go to it. And that is going to lead to the development of Judean Samaria. So the Joseph energy is very much making that happen right now. And I have never seen such a surge of building. It's so funny. It's almost like there's a coronavirus and nobody's here. And in the meantime, the country's being redone to get ready for the multitudes that are going to come and visit us when this thing is over. So that's a part of Hanukkah for me.
And I agree with it. First of all, I think that the Hanukkah story, the Maccabean revolt within Judean society was very much a cultural war between the force of Yosef and the force of Yehudah. The force of Yosef at that time being expressed in a very extreme form as the Mityavnim, as the Hellenized Jews, and the force of Yehudah being expressed also in a pretty extreme way through the Maccabean. But I think today, just getting back to what I said about applying a different type of political labeling in our society, I would say that the real differences between us aren't left and right or religious and secular. The real differences are between those of us who are psychologically living in Jewish history and those of us psychologically living in just the contemporary modern world in any given generation. Right. And I think you'll find, being somebody who lives in Gush Etzion, living in Efrat, living near Yeshivat Har Zion, I think you'll find plenty of Jews who are quote-unquote religious. They're religious. They're Talmidei Chachamim in many cases, but they're psychologically living in Western civilization, the values, the political considerations of Western civilization. And you often meet Jews without kippot who are really living in Jewish history in a very deep way and are willing to fight for that. So I don't think, the labels we have really fit. I do think that within the force of Yosef, let's say today, I think there is what we can call a liberal current and a more nationalist current within the force of Yosef, probably also within the force of Yehudah. There's a liberal current or a left-wing current and a right-wing current. I think those of us those people I mentioned before, Tel Aviv, the Supreme Court justices, Meretz, Haaretz, they're Yosef, they're the liberal current of Yosef. You also have a current of Yosef that I think is expressed through people like Naftali Bennett and Benjamin Netanyahu and Avigdor Lieberman, who see, the disagreements between them are what's better for the Jewish people. Meaning they're all arguing over what makes us safe, what makes us strong, what makes us normal, what makes us healthy, and they're coming to different conclusions. But they're both concerned with that, with the material. Whereas those of us who are concerned with the identity and who are less concerned with what the rest of the world is going to say or what happens to be politically correct in any given generation, and are more focused on the mission and goals of Am Yisrael in history, that would be the force of Yehudah. And even within Yehudah, you might find people like myself. I'm somebody who many people might consider a leftist, not because I want to give away land. I don't want to give away land, obviously. I want the Sinai back and I want Gaza back. And not because and not because I want to dilute the Jewish character of the state, chas v'shalom, but I do recognize historical materialism as a tool that can help us understand the world better. And I think revolutionary theory and post-colonial theory can go a long way in helping us advance the redemption process. But I'm still part of Yehudah, not Yosef, meaning I'm still living psychologically in Jewish history, trying to advance the historic aspirations of our people, trying to achieve the goals that we say we want 3 times a day in the Shemona.
I like what you're saying very much. I would only say, though, that our subjective psychological experience is very important, like you're talking about identity. But on the other hand, I sometimes think that because I do a lot of talking, and so do you, I sometimes think all of our talking and all of our thoughts are good and nice, and they help other people. But God is the zeitgeist. He is running this show. He is bringing his people back. He is driving them through history. He is building up this country. He is having the children of the Jewish children of America either come here or assimilate out, and here having us grow big and being fruitful and multiplying here in the land. And it's running on his time. And some of those people that are at least those that are not anti-Israel, they're doing their thing, and we're all just doing our thing, and this thing is happening in the most kind of organic and natural way, and we can do stuff to mess it up, but if we don't mess it up, it's kind of happening. It's happening its own. The pathway towards a temple in Jerusalem, to me, is like unstoppable. It's unstoppable. And in the meantime, we got to develop Route 60 and put Jews into the Jordan Valley. And also, by the way, we didn't mention this, the Abraham Accords, where our neighbors are starting to recognize that there's really no point in fighting with us. And you know, if you can't beat them, join them. Join the Jewish story one way or another. Accept them as a neighbor, as a Semitic cousin that lives with us. And so all these things are like happening organically. And when we don't have stuff, sometimes I think even less government is better. When the government doesn't do much, it doesn't get so influenced, even ideology doesn't overly influence, and we just kind of naturally have our kids, raise them in Torah, put another house down on this land, bring them to Jerusalem. It's all kind of happening in the most organic fashion. And so, okay, some people are more psychologically, some people are less, but at the end, if you're here in this land and you're not anti, you're part of it, you are propelling this thing. You're part of this organic growth.
We should look, the history has an author that's clearly doing a lot of what you just said, or all of what you just said. The question is, what roles do we want to play?
Right.
And how much?
But that's about our life. And you're talking as an educator, which is great. And I'm just taking it a step out and saying, okay, whatever role that we want to play and to maximize our role in it, and to be really inspired by it and be part of it, that's awesome. And that's what we should do as human beings. But in terms of the grand sweep of history, Hashem is moving the pieces in place, and like this thing is now, he's recalled us back to this land, and it's just happening. It's just happening in its most like, and everybody around sees that it's happening. Smart people understand that this is happening, and smart Arabs, by the way, in our region are like, this is happening. So we might as well kind of get on board with this thing. In any case, last question, and we're done. We went over time. Just one quick question for Yehudah HaKohen. You're lighting the Hanukkah candles, Rabbi Yehudah HaKohen. You're lighting the Hanukkah candles this year. What's your thought? What's your prayer? What's your hope? What's the tear that's coming out of your eye? What is it? What is it about?
That the spirit of the Maccabim, which I think was also the spirit of the Zealot movement and Rabbi Akiva and all of the Jewish liberation movements throughout history, infuse our nation, permeate our nation, and inspire us to reach for and achieve the next step in Jewish liberation, to advance our people's story to the next chapter.
Amen. For me, when I light the candles, I remember the incredible self-sacrifice of the Maccabeim, the incredible courage that it took, and it inspires me to keep fighting. I honor their not just their effort, but their success and their courage, and I just sometimes are like, I hope that we have that internal, some peace, some modicum. You know, the rabbis say there's no one left of the Maccabees. The sages say.
No, we're here.
What's that?
We're here.
That's right.
We're
right.
Here.
A little bit of that Maccabee spirit in all of our hearts. And I just want to put up a comment by Cheryl, who says, "I love the Hanukkah story of faith. Please do not be influenced by other cultures." I think that's what Yehuda HaKohen, in many ways, is also saying to us. Yehuda HaKohen is
it's okay. Meaning we do, like, I agree that the other nations have something to teach us. It's not just a one-way street. We have to receive, also give, but we can't receive things just without filtering what is good. All cultures, not just us. You know, you have to take what's good for your culture, what works for you. You know, again, India has a similar problem to us. They were occupied by the British. They still have structures that don't work for their culture. We're heading into our 4th election in 2 years because we have a political system that doesn't really reflect our identity or culture.
Speaking of the Indians, there was a story in the New York Times a few months ago about Modi, the Prime Minister of India, sitting at an event where they're building a Hindu shrine, a Hindu like prayer shrine over what was a Muslim mosque, which is over what was a Hindu prayer shrine earlier than that. And so he, like, as a national leader, came and supported this thing. And I'm like, hello, can you see the story here? Here was our temple. It was occupied by other peoples. Now we're back, and we should be, proud that our time has come to put our temple up in the same spot. And I said that to people. People were like, it was hard for people to compute, but I was like, look, here's the New York Times story. There's no denial that's the way it was. In any case, I want to wish you lots of love. Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen, you are our modern-day Maccabean inspiration to so many people. People can connect with you more at visionmovement.org, and many of your...
.org. Also, the magazine, which is much more dynamic than the Vision Movement site, is visionmag.org, and you can catch my podcast there. I have 2 podcasts, one on the weekly Torah portion and one on just political issues, advancing Jewish history, called The Next Stage. Check us out on all the relevant platforms and, of course, at visionmag.org.
Yehuda HaKohen, thank you so much for being with us, and happy Hanukkah.
Hanukkah Sameach.